Hey guys, and welcome to the 7th part of this multi-part series on all things Flutter. Today I'll be focusing on widget testing while using the Mockito dependency. Alright, so as always, I have the 7th part branch pushed out, and then we'll be starting off the 6th part, and then working our way up towards the 7th. Okay, so what is widget testing? Alright, so based on the testing docs here, we did cover unit testing in the previous part and widget testing. So as you'd expect, it's basically testing your widgets, whether that's how it looks or how it's interacted. So looks as in like how it's rendered or binding the data itself, or interactions, kind of like tapping, dragging, or inputting text. So you're probably wondering why I entitled the branch 7-1 instead of the 7. So turns out that widget testing itself is going to cover a lot of content. So I decided to divide it into subparts of 2. So the first one focusing on the intro to widget testing, as well as using what's called the finder class to assert that the widget actually exists. And then the second part is the actual interactions. So one important thing to note is basically, as I mentioned in this this paragraph here, is that the widget test is more comprehensive than a unit test, but kind of runs into a limitation where the widgets, it's not as full-fledged as like an integration test down here, where an integration test basically runs against a real device or an emulator simulator, right? So we'll cover this part later on, but for now, just keep this noteworthy. Okay, so as promised, I will also be covering Mockito. So if you open up this bad boy, the Mockito. So basically, we'll be mocking out some of our client service calls and then mocking out some objects to bind the data accordingly. Since by default, actually all of the HTTP requests made in a Flutter widget test returns 400 with an empty response. So we also reap in the benefits of these, right, to avoid flakiness in tests and what's caused by live backends, right, whether that's a web service or database. Okay, so to clarify what I mean exactly and what we'll be actually mocking out within our widgets is given this news API repository, right, so if you remember correctly, it basically has one function, right? It just returns a feature of the top headlines given a parameter, right? So we're basically going to mock this out as we pass it along all of our widgets, okay? It's crucial to know that because once we pass in an instance of the mocked the news API repo, right? Whether that's a real instance or the mocked out one, the run app function will actually run for 2 cases, right? One for the actual app session, and then secondly for the widget test, which you'll see later on. All right. So going back to the docs here, why don't we open up the intro to widget testing, or while simultaneously using Mockito for our tests. All right. So going down the list here. So if you go to our pub/spec YAML file, we'll be needing this flutter test dev dependency, right? Which I showed with the Flutter SDK. So fortunately, this is already here by default. For instance, when you create a new sample project. So that's all you'll need. Okay, so step number 2 is basically we need a widget to test, right? In our case, we have the main root widget, and then the actual widget that contains our data and the change it in state. So headline widget in this case, all right? Going down to number 3. Okay, so it provides us with this helper function here. So for starters, why don't we copy and paste? All right, so we actually need to create a test file here first. So to keep up with the convention of writing tests, like how we did in the last part with the unit tests, we need to have the file name end with _test.dart. Right, so that way we can get the Flutter test runner to map accordingly and recognize the test files within the test package. Okay, so we can call something like get top headline widget score test dot dart. All right. So paste what we had from the snippet here, and then it'll probably complain that we need to import this the Flutter test package here. All right, probably don't need all these comments. All right, cool. So basically now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of actually rendering the widget, we could go back to using Mockito. Okay, so to install this, you just go to the pub.dev page and then go to the installing section, copy and paste this as an ordinary dependency, and then let VS Code work its magic of automatically getting the pub. Should see the pop up here. But while it does that, we could continue moving forward. Okay, so step 1 is done. And then, as mentioned earlier, the function we'll be testing is basically the get call from our news API repo. All right, so got that. Okay, so we could go back to our widget test here. Create out our mocked API client class, right? So it'll look something like this. So this extends from the mock class and then implements your repo. All right, so for starters, first import the Mockito.dart package, and then change this to implement from the news API repo. Okay, so there's our mock client class. And then to actually mock out our client service calls with a mocked out response, it'll look something like this, right? So first is first. Before we get into the assertions and whatnot, we could copy and paste these for now. We have the mock client instance here, so we really need to just replace this with our actual get function. Okay, so here, let's get rid of this mess quick. All right. So based on our last part for unit testing, so remember how we mocked out the shared preference keys and values, right, during a test session? Why don't we grab this as well, just to spice up our tests here. Okay, so import these. So really to just pass in Google News while testing out this external dependency for shared preferences. All right, so basically, as you remember, let's get our shared preference instance. Then all it is for accessing is retrieving the value by its key. So that in this case, so it'll just be Google News. All right, so here's the when function for the mocked out logic. Basically, we're mocking and stubbing this client function here, and then handles the callback logic through the dot then answer function, and this is where we want to mock out the response. So how that'll look is, let's just import the headline package class. All right, and just pass in some dummy values, right? So in this case, it could just be, so just takes in status, total results, articles, and then here's a sample response on Postman of what it exactly would look like. Okay, so map accordingly with the status value. All right, so I should probably mention that in Dart, without the curly braces, basically these will be defaulted as positional arguments, but just to stay sane, I figured that we make these named arguments, named and optional rather. Okay, so all it takes is just wrapping all the properties within your constructor with curly braces. All right, so if you go back, reference status, and then pass in a value of OK, right? Assuming it's like a 200. Okay, and then total results. Let's worry about mocking out a response later. I just wanted to get this set up for now. So total results could just temporarily be 10. And then the articles, considering that we have no results, it'll just be an empty list. Oh, of course, gotta pass in articles and then empty list. All right, cool. Before I forget, I should probably wrap these with curly braces as well, because we'll be digging into these too later on. All right, awesome. So that's all we'll be needing from the docs here for all things Mockito. So if we go back, worry about the assertions later, as ours will be pretty different. Okay, so going back to our intro to widget doc. So we have the widget tester here, and then notice that one of the helper functions we can use is what's called the pump widget, right? So all it is that it basically renders the widget, right? Like every time the state of the widget changes, we render it accordingly within the widget tree, right? So we have here all kinds of pump functions, right? So basically, given this argument here, right, it takes in a widget you want to pump. Remember how I mentioned that we'll be starting from the root widget down to the headline or the child widget, right? So before we do that, right, so I might as well just write it down of how it looks. So if you copy and paste this, it takes in the widget. So in our case, it'll be widget D&D headlines made widget, right? Import that. So there's no constructor for this, but considering that we want to handle both cases for app sessions as well as widget testing, we could create a new constructor here, right? To pass in the actual news API repo instance as well as the mocked API instance. So in this case, why don't we create a required constructor param. Of course, why don't we pass in, or create our property here. Call something like news API repo. So this dot news API repo. Okay, and then it'll complain that we need to pass in a instance there. Use the named argument to pass in an instance. So this run app function, right? As I mentioned earlier, that's what the pump widget function will actually do. Okay, so to handle the scenario of a real app session, let's just pass in an instance of this now. And then we won't be needing this. Need a semicolon there. And then basically we'll just be passing it down all the way to the headline widget. Okay, so let's also make this required. So basically, so instead of, you're probably wondering like, hey Dave, why not just, use the provider package to handle dependency injection? So this is actually, just a sample tutorial. So just to keep it, or for the sake of simplicity, I'm just gonna, pass these instances down and nest them. So, but yeah, maybe save the provider package for like a later tutorial in this multi-part series. So we'll see how it goes. But for now, let's just simply pass it down the widget tree. So let's make this required as well. This .news API repo. And then make this required as well while we're at it. All right, and then pass it in here. And then we could simply call it. So remember how it was a field? It was like basically a global field in this file, right? But now I'll be calling it from the passed in constructor within this widget class here. So got a call there, another one there. All right, cool. So going back to our widget test, it'll complain, it'll expect a repo instance. So in our case, it'll just be the mocked client. All right, cool. So now with this mock or this instantiated widget with the mocked API client instance, we just simply pass it in. All right. So now onto the assertion part, right? After we have our widget pumped and beginning the rendering process, right, of this widget, what should we assert, right? So considering that we get the headline response, right, but no actual data. Okay, so I was thinking like with our future builder logic, say if there was no data and no error, why don't we assert this progress bar, like while the future is being retrieved from the backend? Okay, so that's where the first pump comes in, right? To build out our first frame. So we could use the notorious expect function to make the assertion with our actual and the matcher. So basically, that's when what's called the finder class, as I mentioned earlier, comes in. Okay, so going to step 5, here's a description of how the finder class works. So basically, if we open up this doc and then look at some samples here, you get a high-level overview of one sample of how finding by a text widget, with this kind of string value or text value name. So these are a few examples, but if I wanted to go to, that didn't open. Okay, so if you open up this part, notice that it provides other ways to find the widget, see if it was actually rendered within the widget tree, right? So whether that's by the text widget or by the key instance given a widget with this kind of key name, or by a specific widget instance. Okay, so more onto that later on as we'll actually be using it. If not this first part, then the second part. So we'll actually be using another finds function. It's not listed here, but just to keep it simple, when in doubt, we use this by key. But just to have a less boilerplate, we could what's called find dot by type. Here's our the class. So it's basically a helper progress bar widget. So if we just pass that in and import it, and then the matcher of what we match against, right? Going back to the sample snippet here, we could just invoke functions like this. So simply it just finds one widget as you'd expect. If it exists, I'll need our comma here. So this will basically pass if the widget is found. All right, so now to the fun part where we actually run this widget test. So why don't we set up some breakpoints here and then watch exactly how it works, right? Just to justify how this run function is running from the pump widget function instead of the app session itself. So we could set some breakpoints here just to test out our conditionals of the future builder, one there. And then maybe go down here as far as the widget being built with all of our respective data. Okay. So if we just press VS Code's debug link here, it should fire off. Okay, so notice the first breakpoint is setting out our mock shared preferences. All right, so here's the mock function call. So once that fires, and then this pump widget function is, the breakpoint is fired off next. Notice that the widget starts to build. So going to our debug panel here, the snapshot has no data or error, so that's when the progress bar is being rendered, right? So that's our first frame. And then here's the source ID, the Google News. Notice that it was successfully mocked out, so it retrieves it and then makes the get call for top headlines. Okay, And then the first assertion. Next. All right, going to the test results. Notice that it passed. Cool. All right. So that's the first one. Why don't we spice things up a bit even more? So fortunately, we could reference this moving forward for our remaining tests. So why don't we copy and paste this for our next one? Oh, I should probably mention that we should have changed our name, this test in particular. So maybe call it something like loads and starts off with a progress bar. All right. Okay, secondly, why don't we actually show some headline article data, right? So these instances will be the same. But in this case, we're actually gonna change out the mocked response. So it'll still be headline, right? But we do want at least one result to be shown. Okay, so that's when we create the dummy article data as well as nested in the headline object. So it'll look something like article, and then going to the class itself, it'll take in these properties, right? Fortunately, we don't need all of these properties to actually exist. So going back to our main.dar file, right? So the critical headline data that we'll be needing from the article object is article.title, article.published@. Because if you remember here, we're just calculates the time difference from the article that was published or when it was published. So I actually have a reference here of ideally what we want to create for the article, the dummy article that is. So if we just give it a title and then the published timestamp, and then another one that we'll be needing is the get article source name. So in this case, we wanted to have a source object and a name, right? Because remember that we're populating here on the app bar, right? So Google News in this case. Okay, so why don't we create out those properties for now. Okay, so title, just to match against the screenshot here, will be test article title. And then, okay, just to keep it simple, why don't we borrow this timestamp here, implying the first day of the new year with no time exactly, just the date. Okay, so now we want to pass in a source object, and then similarly to how it is on Postman, just takes in an ID and name. So in this case, Google News in different formats. All right, why don't we copy and paste it individually? And then the name. Okay, so the first pump, we'll pump out the first frame, right, to run out the progress bar widgets. So the assertion, we could actually reference one of these samples here of using the finder class. So it's as simple as just finding by the text widget, right? So in our case, if the article does indeed have a title, that's when it uses the text widget. And then we could find by the actual value of the text. Okay, so find by text. Sorry, it's just text. And then you can find it by this title right here. Okay, and then, yep, leave it as is for finds one widget. Okay, so let's see, just given the only one pump widget to pump out the first frame of the overall widget tree, let's see where it takes us, right? Ideally, we want it to at least take us here, right? Where we first return the headline widget comprised of the actual data from the snapshot from the async op, as well as, you know, building out this part of the widget, the actual data rendering. So let's see if we can make it this far. Okay, so if I debug this guy, okay, next breakpoint. So makes our mocked out call there, makes our first pump. So just like our previous test here, it renders out the progress bar. Okay. And then our assertion, right? So we're expecting to find out this, find the dummy article item, right? But it doesn't, hence this exception is thrown. So this is basically implying that one widget was expected, but none was found, right? Okay, so we could close that. So you're probably thinking, hey, why don't you invoke that pump widget function again? All right. So if we just literally copy and paste that, let's see what happens next. Which is about, you know, on the right track to pump enough frames to actually see the article UI. So there's the first frame. Here, we don't need this breakpoint as much anymore. Another pump. All right, cool. So we actually made it this far with the headline widgets rendered. Next, okay, returns the scaffold app. And then ideally, we want to see a card with the article, right? Okay. So here's the article. Notice that it has the dummy values we passed in. So test article title, and then the source properties. Then next. So it starts that, and then passed. So that might have worked, but traditionally we could use what's also called the pump and settle function, and this basically keeps invoking the pump function until there's no more schedule animations or frames to complete, right? So considering that we have this conditions of progress bar and then all the way as far as rendering the data, this is more of like a safety blanket, if you will, to just make sure that the widgets are all laid out in front of us. Okay, so let's see what happens when we run this again, just to make sure that we get what we want. Okay, so the first pump, and then pump and settle. The same idea. Get our article data there. Asserts. Passed. Cool. Alright, before I forget again, what do we rename this? Something like loads and shows headline article data. Alright, awesome. Moving forward. So I think we got what we needed for now. Oh yeah, here's the sixth part where it just explains the matcher with the finds one widgets. Okay. So we could create a few more tests here, just to test out all edge cases. Okay, so we ideally want, so considering that this will be a successful response, right? But with no articles data in this case. So if you remember correctly, we have some logic set up here, right, to render out the list view widget. So basically it takes in the child's widget. So if there is, or if the articles is not empty, right, then that's when we actually render out the list of articles. Otherwise, this will get rendered. So debug this. Okay, call the mocked out call. Pump the first frame. Run all the scheduled pump animations. Okay, so we have our headline object returned status, okay, and then all right, bam, and there it is. So if the articles is empty, we just display an empty state text widget with that text instead of running out a list. All right, return. Okay, cool. Test results say that test has passed as well. All right, cool. Well, so another matcher we could try matching the assertion against is kind of like this. It's kind of like so if we just copy and paste this, so if there's article data, right, just to piggyback what I was saying for this logic here, for if there is articles, then render out a list view, but otherwise if there is, then there's what's called finds nothing, right? So if there's no widgets in the widget tree, then this will be successful, right? So why don't we try that and rerun the same test that actually gives us some articles. All right, first breakpoint, pump and settle. Okay. All right, so here's the assertion we just wrote. So it won't display this empty state, right? Considering that articles exist. All right, notice that it was not interrupted, so deemed successful. Fire that assertion as well. And there it is. The loads and shows headline article data has passed. All right, so this last test, I was thinking it's actually similar to this, the empty state one. But in this case, we're gonna try to forcefully throw an error just to handle the edge case, right? If the network errors out and doesn't give us a response. So we wanted to fire this breakpoint. Okay, so if the snapshot has an error. So how we do that is we just simply throw an exception here, right? So in this case, it'll just be an exception of a string message. So maybe call it something like failed to load response. All right. Okay, the pump logic will be the same as well as the assertion, right? Considering we're using that for both cases of errors and no article data. So this could be changed to something like shows empty state from erroring out. All right, so debug this. Okay, next breakpoint. All right, so the progress bar is rendered. Okay, exception has occurred. Failed to load response. Pump and settle. Going to our debug panel here. Notice that the breakpoint is indeed giving us an error. There it is. The dummy string we just created. So assert that the empty state text is rendered from the test widget here. All right, and then next. And there it is, guys. 4 out of 4 passed for all of these widget tests. Whew, I know that was a lot I was throwing out at you guys. Fortunately, I decided to split this in 2 parts. So the next part, as I said earlier, we'll be testing out the interactions. So if you open up this, we'll be getting to these docs here. But for now, that's all I had in mind. But otherwise, if you guys have any questions for how I did this, just feel free to leave in the comment below or reach me via Twitter. And yeah, till next time, guys, I'll see you for the second part of widget testing.